Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is the first video in a series of videos about Invictus, a role-playing game that I've been building now for the better part of a decade. Um, Invictus is intended to be a plausible fantasy game. I recognize that plausible and fantasy seem like odd words to go together, but what I'm after is a game that makes sense. When you see the characters and you see how they work and you see their abilities and you see their powers, you say, oh, yeah, I get it. I understand that. And then you see some random character that can suddenly fly. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So I'm looking for things that have an in-game reason for how they work. And I wanted to start out with the combat system, more specifically the wound system, which it really is the bedrock of this game and how it works. I've played Dungeons & Dragons, Pathfinder, and dozens of other games. Everything World of Darkness, Exalted, GURPS, some hero system. I've now tried a little bit of Pathfinder, which is really your D&D D20, but well designed. And so I've done a lot of these games and I've loved them. I've loved every one of them, but almost all of them left me wanting when it came to the nuts and bolts of combat. And that's what I'm after. Now, if you knew me, you might be a little surprised by me saying this because I don't actually do a lot of combat in my games. I prefer social encounters. And I think one of the reasons that is quite often combat just doesn't really get that itch, doesn't really feel good. So that's what I'm after. All right, so how does this work? Invictus is going to be right now a 3d6 system, whereas there is only a hit roll, unlike new games like MCDM RPG, and I think Into the Odd did this as well. You don't roll to hit and then roll for damage, and I know that that's not a brand new system, but instead what I've got is just a roll to hit. And so you roll to hit, and based on how well you hit, that determines how much damage you've done. And so wounds are distributed not like you have a pile of 40 hit points, but instead your wounds might look something like this. So you'd have some amount of light wounds, some amount of moderate wounds, some amount of severe wounds. And an average person with a body of 4 might have a wound profile that looks something like this. When you take damage, you're generally taking 1 to 8 points of damage. It can be a little open-ended, but it's rare that you're going to take damage of that size. So what does this mean? Well, let's imagine now you were to take a hit for 2 points of damage. You would now mark that as a light wound. So that's 2 points of damage in this light wound. How did you know it was a light wound? It's less than 3. If you had instead taken 4 points of damage, that would not fit in the light wound because the biggest light wound you can take is 3. So now that would count as 4 points in that medium wound. Characters are also going to come from 3 different body types: a slight build, an average build, or a stout build, where a slight build is often going to be something like a halfling or a gnome or maybe a really slender elf or goblin, someone that just doesn't have a lot of kind of meat on their body that's going to have a harder time taking that blow. Those characters will conversely gain bonuses to agility and things of that nature, but the amount of light wounds, as you see here, are going to be lower than if you had a different sized body. And that's just me trying to put in a little bit more verisimilitude and kind of understanding what's happening in the game. So let's imagine now you're in combat, you get hit, you take 7 points of damage. As you see here, that's going to be basically a death blow for these 2 characters here, because that 7 is going to skip the light wounds, skip the medium wounds, and go straight to severe wounds. So in this case, you would lose all your severe wounds. Once you get to that point, you're unconscious and you're dying. You make a saving throw to see if you die immediately. In this case, for the average body build, taking that 7 points of damage is going to do the same thing. You're going to run out of that health. You're going to be dead. Only for someone with a severe, with a stout build could actually survive a 7-point hit. Now you see this is true even though each of these has light wounds and moderate or medium wounds left over. So this is a game where you can leave a pretty corpse. And this is actually a concept that I really, really like, right? So you can leave a pretty corpse. That is, you can leave a body, that has lots of wounds left and just be dead. This game also naturally sets up a death spiral. What do I mean by that? Well, when you take light wounds, they're light, no major impact to yourself. But if you take moderate wounds or severe wounds, it'll actually reduce every die roll you make thereafter. That is, there are wound penalties. So if you take a wound, for example, a severe wound for some reason, and you go forward and you don't get that healed up right away, you're going to be sitting with a wound penalty until that gets healed up. Okay, so what about armor? How does armor work? Armor has two stats on it that are most important here. Armor has what's called a soak stat and a distribute stat. The soak stat is what the armor just eats up right away. So if you get hit, in this case a male hauberk, it has a soak of 2. So if you took 2 points of damage, nothing would pass through to you. The armor would take all of that damage up. It also has a distribute score of 2. That means that if you take, say, 4 points of damage, 2 would get soaked right away, leaving 2 points. And then those 2 points would get distributed. What does that mean? Well, it turns them into 2 1-point increments. So you would take those 2 1-point increments. If instead you were hit, for say 6 points of damage, how would that be handled? Okay, so at 6 points, 2 get soaked right away, leaving you with 4. 2 then gets distributed for single wounds, leaving 2 left, and then you take a hit for 2. So that's what your character would now look like. It doesn't necessarily seem like that big a deal, but let's imagine now you took another hit for 6. So that next hit for 6 distributes 2 into that way, and then puts 2 into a moderate wound because they spill over. So we see what armor is doing is allowing these light wounds to get used up, spreading that damage out and keeping you moving. The game will also include bleeding and things of this nature. I don't want to get into that too much right now. I'll cover that in a future video. But let's take a look at like how wounds would be different for different species. And in my game, I don't use the term race. I don't like it. I never have. I use instead the term genus. So a halfling or a gnome might look something like this. A human or a drak or a drakon might look something like this. Dwarves or orcs might look something like that. And these are all variable based on the choices you make during character creation, etc. But these are just different potential wound profiles that a character might have. So we see here, if a gnome gets hit for 3 points of damage, that's immediately going to become a medium wound for them. But if a human also got hit for 3 points of damage, that would be no big deal. That goes into their light wounds. We see that dwarves and orcs can simply take more light wound punishment, although they have a slightly higher moderate wound that they can take before they die. Now, this might seem maybe a little slow, that you've got to take all these different hits before you die, but what I'll tell you is in practice, in play, death comes very quickly to characters. It is not uncommon to get hit for 6 or 7 points of damage, where very quickly you're chewing up all of these medium wounds and maybe into these severe wounds. I want to thank you so much for watching this video. I'm going to talk more about this in the future. This was just me getting started, sharing some basic ideas of the game so that you don't have to read them. Thank you.